The first sound was not the peal of bells themselves, but their rehearsal, a muddled iron chatter breaking the stillness above the high street. I had paused beneath the grey facade of St. Aldate's, watching students drift past in scarves and damp wool, their laughter dissolving into the rain-dark air. Evening bells in Oxford carry the odd ability to unsettle me. They announce order, tradition, the march of hours, and yet behind their regularity I always sense a disturbance, a missed note, a falter, a human hand slipping against the rope. It had been one of those raw November nights, when the lamps glow in the mist and the wet cobblestones reflect a wavering amber. I remember pulling my coat close, already thinking of whiskey, when Lewis, beside me, shifted uneasily and said something about the bells being out of practice. He was right. There was a hesitation between strokes, as if the pattern had been interrupted. I told him not everything imperfect must mean something. Even as I said it, I didn't quite believe it. We had not come for bells. We had come because of a call from the porter of Brasenose, who insisted a trivial matter required police attention. A bicycle had been abandoned in the quad, chained to the railings, its tyres caked with country mud. A bicycle left too long in Oxford is nothing remarkable, and yet the porter's tone suggested unease. He had seen it arrive late afternoon, but not the rider. By dusk the machine still waited, wet and solitary, the drizzle making its frame glisten like a relic pulled from a river. Inside the porter's lodge the air smelled of tobacco and damp wool. The man himself was cautious, deferential, as though he feared disturbing some greater order. He spoke in half sentences, pausing to polish his glasses as though truth lay hidden in the act. Lewis, more patient than I, drew out the facts. The bicycle was old-fashioned, a Rayleigh with worn handles, no light fixed. Its rear mudguard carried a faint splash of dried paint crimson, out of place against the black. A careless scrape, perhaps, or something else. I stepped out again, circling the machine. What struck me was not its neglect, but its deliberation. The chain was new, the lock unforced, the saddle still warm enough to suggest recent use. And there was the bell, a cheap silver fitting dulled by rust, positioned oddly close to the brake lever, as though someone had shifted it in haste. I turned it once, the faintest metallic chime escaping, quickly lost in the night. Bells in the evening again. Always bells. Lewis asked what I thought. I said very little, though my mind turned quietly over the detail of the paint, the misaligned bell, the oddity of a student entering a college, yet not returning, for the machine that carried him. Or her. Oxford is full of abandoned things, essays, ideals, lovers. Yet rarely are they left in such neat, deliberate order. We left the bicycle under the porter's nervous care, promising nothing more than a note in the log. As we walked back beneath the dripping stone arches, Lewis muttered about wasted evenings. I listened without answering, because somewhere behind the muddle of bells and the quiet drizzle, I had felt that curious tightening of the mind which arrives unbidden, like the half-solved clue of a crossword left open on a breakfast table. The kind where the answer does not yet appear, but its shadow is already present, faint but insistent. That night, alone in my flat, I poured whiskey into the glass that always seems too large for one man. I opened the crossword, stared at the half-completed grid, 7 down, 5 letters. A sound that lingers after its source is gone. The answer came quickly. I wrote it in, listening again in memory to the bells, their imperfect echo crossing the city. I felt, though I could not yet prove, that somewhere a life had already faltered in much the same way. I walked through the cloisters with the rain still on my shoulders, the air close with the scent of wet stone. The lamps along the passage flickered against centuries of names carved into the walls, initials that had outlasted the voices which once spoke them. Oxford has its silences, and none are deeper than those held within cloisters after dark. They breathe with the hush of something watched, but never spoken. Lewis's footsteps echoed behind me, a rhythm too steady for the hour. He was already wondering why we were here. A bicycle left abandoned did not require this kind of intrusion. Yet something in me demanded the return. Not to the porter's lodge, not to the quad, but to this long corridor where the rain seemed to lean inward, where stone arches pressed upon us like questions. The porter had said no one had come to claim the bicycle, no visitors signed in, no student missing at supper. Yet in the cloisters I found myself counting windows. One in every second archway, latticed, narrow. I paused by the third. The glass was ajar by less than an inch. In weather such as this, no sensible man would leave a window open. Lewis asked if I wanted him to fetch a key. I said no, some doors are better left unopened, at least until the mind has turned them into necessity. Still I noted the mark on the still faint track where water had run inward. Someone had closed the pane too late, or had left in haste, the latch forgotten. We moved further past the chapel door where a brass handle glowed dimly. The air changed, their incense lingering, mixed with the faint smell of extinguished candles. Bells again, though this time only imagined, carried in memory from the evening. A student brushed past us then, books pressed close to his chest, eyes lowered as though reading while walking. He muttered something, an apology, or prayer, I couldn't tell. He vanished through the arch before I could catch the colour of his scarf. Lewis whispered that the place gave him the creeps. I almost envied him. For me, it gave not fear, but a sense of confirmation, that strange tightening of thought which comes when detail insists upon itself. The open window, the hurried student, the silence where supper should have brought noise. These things arranged themselves not as facts, but as half-clues, like letters forming in the crossword before the solution is ready. At the far end, where the cloisters bent toward the library, we stopped. There on the flagstones lay a scattering of papers. Damp, smudged ink, a corner of what once was a timetable or lecture notes. The writing was nearly lost to the rain, but I traced one word with my finger. Alone, it meant little. Together with the bicycle, the window, the hurried figure, it began to whisper something I could not yet catch. Lewis bent to gather the papers, but I told him to leave them. Objects speak most truly when left in the places where they fall. Disturb them too early, and the story rearranges itself. He frowned, though he has learned not to argue in such moments. We stood in silence, the cloisters holding us in their cold embrace. Somewhere above, a door closed softly, almost kindly. I thought again of bells. Their task is to order time, to tell men when to pray, when to study, when to eat. Yet in their order lies the measure of disorder. One missed bell, one faltered note, and everything falls into question. So too with life I felt brushing past us tonight, something not yet missing, yet already misplaced. Later, when I tried to sleep, I thought of the crossword again. 12 across 7 letters, an absence that signals presence. The word I realized with an unease I could not dispel was silence. And in the silence of those cloisters something had already spoken. The common rooms smelled of smoke that lingered from pipes and the faint ghost of port that had been poured too freely earlier in the evening. Old armchairs sagged under the weight of generations, and portraits of stern fellows peered down as though disapproving of the present company. I never felt entirely welcome in such rooms, though I carried myself with the false ease of a man pretending to belong. Lewis stood awkwardly near the fireplace, his hands folded like a schoolboy on visiting day. He was unused to the rituals of dons and deference, the small courtesies of a world that dined on Latin quotation as easily as roast lamb. I envied him in part, for his discomfort was honest. Mine was more concealed, and therefore more exhausting. A don in a velvet waistcoat approached, his eyes bright with a curiosity poorly disguised as courtesy. He spoke of the bicycle as though it were a triviality. Students forgot things all the time. Perhaps one had gone for supper in town, or to a lecture at another college. He smiled at Lewis, not at me, then retreated to the warmth of the fire. I wandered along the shelves, books leather-bound, their spines cracked with neglect. One volume lay slightly out of line, its edge marked by a dust-free rectangle. Recently taken down, though not recently read, I suspected, a work on medieval theology. I replaced it quietly. Lewis caught my glance but said nothing. The fellows conversed in murmurs, as if guarding secrets from one another even while sharing them. A phrase floated toward my chapel window, unlatched again. I felt a small stirring. I remembered the open pane in the cloisters, rain intruding where it should not. These casual slips of tongue often tell more than long statements. Lewis leaned toward me and whispered that we were wasting our time. I half agreed, though something in the atmosphere of the room held me. It was not what was said, but what was left unsaid. The dons spoke of examinations, of the new bursa, of the rising cost of sherry. Yet beneath their tones lay something too careful, a silence stitched into their chatter. I asked, as though in passing, whether the college bells had sounded as usual. A fellow with thin spectacles replied at once that they had, of course, precisely at 7. He said it too firmly, as though rehearsed. Bells again, always the bells. When we stepped back toward the door, a young lecturer brushed past me with a muttered good night. His sleeve brushed mine. On it, a faint smear of crimson, almost dry. A trace of paint, I thought, not blood, though in truth the distinction crossed my mind too quickly. I remembered the bicycle's mudguard, streaked with a crimson splash, a careless coincidence, perhaps, or something closer. Lewis did not see it. He was already out in the corridor. I lingered, watching the young man's retreating figure vanish into shadow. A detail too small to accuse, yet large enough to trouble sleep. Back at my desk later that night, the crossword waited. 14 down 6 letters. A sign that points yet says nothing. I wrote it slowly, finger resting on the pen. Symbol. The word seemed to echo against the walls of my flat. A bicycle abandoned, a window ajar, a sleeve brushed with paint. Symbols, all of them. And like most symbols, they remained just beyond the edge of certainty, waiting for someone to misread or to see them rightly. The letter arrived folded twice, its envelope creased as though it had been carried too long in an uncertain pocket. The porter at Brasenose handed it over with the faint look of a man unwilling to touch something he could not quite explain. No name upon the front, no college seal, only my own surname scrawled in a hand that faltered between elegance and haste. I slipped it into my coat and said nothing. Later, alone in my room, I read it by the dim yellow light of a desk lamp. The handwriting was feminine, the ink slightly smudged at the edge where a pause had been too long. She wrote of nothing explicit. A meeting missed, a voice remembered, the faint suggestion that something promised had gone unkept. The words bent themselves away from clarity, as if truth would scorch the page were it written too directly. Lewis had asked earlier what kept me awake at night. I had said crosswords, though the answer was rarely so simple. It was letters like this, with their half-spoken grief, their veiled intimacies, their refusal to declare whether they were plea or confession. A woman's letter can weigh more than evidence, for it binds emotion to silence in ways no court can ever unravel. I turned the sheet over, tracing the indentations on the back. The writer pressed hard, impatiently. A phrase that stood out the bells confused me. I lingered on it. Bells again, always returning like an echo through stone. She did not say which bells, nor when, only that confusion had followed them. I tried, foolishly, to hear her voice as I read. Was it resignation or defiance? Was she frightened or merely unwilling to name herself? The absence of signature was deliberate. No one forgets their own name. The next morning I carried the letter back into the college, folded deep into my coat. I told Lewis little beyond that it concerned our case. He asked from whom. I replied that if the sender wished me to know, she would not have hidden herself. He frowned, muttering that it might be nothing, yet in his tone I heard the faintest shadow of belief. We stood again in the cloisters, mist rising from the flagstones. I reread the lines in silence. One sentence pressed itself forward. Though faint, I left it as you asked. What it referred to remained unspoken. A bicycle, a book, a promise. Left where? For whom? My mind turned these questions like coins in the pocket, each side catching light, then vanishing into shadow. Lewis noticed my distraction and said we should ask the fellows. I shook my head. Fellows conceal more than they reveal. A woman's letter, however, contains what she cannot say aloud. One must read, not words, but spaces, the hesitation between clauses, the places where ink grows darker. That evening I found myself again at my desk with the crosswords spread open. 9 down 8 letters, written but never spoken. I considered it for a long while before writing it in. Epistle. I looked back at the folded sheet, at the hand that pressed so firmly into paper, and wondered whether she knew her words had reached me at all. I poured whiskey and held the glass in silence. Outside, bells sounded across the city of Magdalen, perhaps, or St. Giles, their notes colliding in the damp air. I thought of her phrase, the bells confused me. They confused me too, yet in their confusion lay a kind of pattern, irregular, imperfect, human. And somewhere in that discord, I felt, the truth waited patiently, sealed within the unsentences of a woman's letter. The college library has never been a place of comfort for me, though I confess it has drawn me often enough. The air is thick with the smell of dust and paper, that dry scent of centuries stored and rarely touched. I entered late, the lamps already lit, their glow muted beneath green shades that threw the tables into pools of weary concentration. Students bent over notes, their faces pale in the light, while the silence pressed down like an additional weight upon every book. The librarian rose from behind her desk with a precision that suggested reluctance rather than welcome. She was a woman of indeterminate years, the sort who cultivated invisibility by moving gently, never hurrying, never pausing too long. I saw at once that she feared our presence, though she disguised it as courtesy. She asked whether the noise of bells troubled us at night. The question was so unexpected that Lewis laughed aloud, but I did not laugh. We said we had come merely to confirm the borrowing of a particular volume, a small request, hardly unusual. Yet as she searched her ledger, her hands trembled slightly, the ink trembling with them. She turned too many pages, then returned, as though retracing steps along a path she wished to obscure. The book in question, a collection of medieval sermons, had been borrowed 2 weeks prior, and according to her neat script, had not yet been returned. She would not look at me when she said it. Lewis asked the borrower's name. She hesitated, then gave it. A young lecturer, the same whose sleeve I had noticed, brushed with crimson paint in the common room. The connection pressed forward in my mind with uncomfortable neatness. The bicycle, the open window, the sleeve, the book, each alone a trifle, together a pattern still unfinished. When the librarian thought herself unobserved, she touched the edge of the ledger with her finger, tracing not the name she had spoken, but the line above it. A woman's name. Written, then crossed out. I saw how the ink differed, darker where it had been blotted. She turned the page too quickly, but not before I had fixed the detail in memory. I asked if she had ever mislaid her keys. She stiffened, her answer too prompt, never. Yet I had already seen the faint bulge of a second keyring beneath her sleeve, one not belonging to the library but to a private place she kept close. A librarian has her secrets, and this one lies not in the books themselves, but in the shadows between them. Lewis, restless, began to wander the aisles. He returned with a pamphlet slipped between volumes of poetry, a pamphlet printed cheaply, stained with damp, its cover torn. On it was a sermon text about sin and silence. Lewis asked if it belonged here. The librarian's eyes flickered with annoyance, or fear, and she said sharply that many things found their way in by mistake. She reached for the pamphlet, but I gestured to Lewis to keep it. The silence of the library thickened. The only sound was the slow creak of floorboards beneath our feet. Somewhere high above, a door closed gently. I wondered if someone had been listening all along. That night at home, I spread the pamphlet across my desk beside the woman's letter. I read the phrases again, letting them echo against each other. One line in the pamphlet caught me the truth. A book is unopened. The words lingered uncomfortably like a half-remembered hymn. The crossword lay open beside them. 11 across 9 letters, hidden in plain sight. I stared at it for a long while before writing the answer. Palimpsest. A text written over another, the original half-effaced, but never wholly gone. And it was then I understood, or thought I did. The librarian had not erased the truth, only written another story over it, hoping no one would read beneath. But like every palimpsest, the shadow of the first words still showed through, if only one cared enough to look. The bells sounded again across Oxford, muffled through the mist. And in their echo I heard not certainty, but a question, waiting, patiently, unanswered, within the librarian's secret. The chapel was never warmer than a tomb, cold stone, the air faint with wax, and a sweetness left by lilies long since wilted. The boys were rehearsing when I entered, their voices rising like pale smoke into the dim rafters. Oxford choirs have always unsettled me, that union of innocence and discipline, the sound too pure for the bodies that produced it. Lewis lingered at the door, his hands deep in his coat pockets, unwilling to disturb the music. I walked slowly down the aisle, past pews polished smooth by generations of elbows and knees. The organist glanced at me without a word. His hands hovered above the keys, as though my presence might break the order of things. When the hymn ended, a boy near the front turned his head. He could not have been more than 12, his hair untidy, his surplice too large for him. He whispered to the boy beside him, then looked back again, his eyes catching mine with a kind of impish defiance. Later, as the others shuffled away, he lingered near the lectern, staring at me as though he had rehearsed the moment. I asked what kept him there. He said very quietly that the bells had been wrong last night. He spoke not as a child exaggerating, but with the seriousness of one who knows his duty. The tenor bell struck twice, he said, when it should have been once. Only once. Lewis dismissed it with a shrug. Children notice trifles, but trifles often prove more enduring than facts. I crouched slightly and asked him if he was certain. He nodded, his gaze steady. He said the librarian had been standing near the south transept when the bells began. She raised her hand as though in greeting, but no one was there to greet. The remark slid into me like a stone into water, sinking quietly but refusing to vanish. The librarian again. Always the librarian. And the bells, confused yet precise in their confusion. I thanked the boy, though he did not seem to want thanks. He slipped away, his small shoes echoing against the stone floor. I stood for a long while in the empty chapel, listening to the silence that followed him. Lewis muttered that it meant nothing, that boys invent stories to please themselves. I answered that stories are rarely invented without origin. Outside, the cloisters smelled of damp wool and November rain. I recalled the woman's letter, her phrase, "The bells confused me." The boy had not read her letter, yet he echoed her words almost exactly. I thought of two voices, humming the same line of a melody without ever having heard each other. That night at my desk I opened the crossword again. 16 across 5 letters, a child who speaks truth unknowingly. I smiled faintly as I filled it in. Angel. The word unsettled me more than it should have. I poured another whiskey, listening through the window, to the city breathing in its uneasy quiet. Somewhere a bell struck, late, its sound imperfect, followed by another too quickly. The choirboy's remark returned, insistent. Bells do not err without reason. Hands falter, ropes slip, but rarely do they repeat by chance. I thought of the librarian raising her hand, as if signalling into emptiness. Perhaps not emptiness, perhaps to someone hidden, someone who needed the sound of bells to cover a departure or disguise an arrival. I let the whiskey rest in my hand, the glass warm against the cold evening. A boy's small voice, a woman's smudged ink, a crimson stain on a sleeve, none of them conclusive, yet together they pressed upon me like the weight of unfinished music. And even now, recalling it, I hear his whisper again. The tenor bell struck twice. A remark dismissed by most, but to me it was a note struck wrong in a score that otherwise demanded perfection. The kind of error that signals not a mistake, but a message. The evening rehearsals in the chapel resumed, though I cannot say I went there seeking music. It was the echo I wanted, the way sound folded back upon itself in that high, vaulted space, and the way notes collided and refused to settle. Lewis joined me reluctantly, his face carrying that look he wore when duty carried him into worlds he had no wish to enter. He muttered that the choirs always sounded the same. I thought otherwise. The organ thundered through the first bars of a hymn, the boys' voices layered above it in precise intervals. Yet precision is not always true. One note wavered, clashing with its neighbour, a false harmony, brief, easily overlooked. But to a mind accustomed to disorder, it rang like confession. I watched the choirmaster as he lifted his hand sharply, demanding correction. His eyes betrayed irritation, though not at the boys. He glanced once toward the south transept, where the librarian stood half hidden in shadow. She raised her chin slightly, almost imperceptibly, before lowering her gaze to the stone floor. Lewis saw none of this. He whispered that he would wait outside, preferring cigarettes to hymns. I let him go. Silence can be heard better without commentary. After the rehearsal, I remained, leaning against the cold wood of a pew. The librarian passed close by, offering the faintest smile, though her eyes did not linger on mine. I noticed the pamphlet again in her hand, folded too tightly, as if she feared what might spill from its pages. She dropped it into her bag, her fingers trembling, not with age, but with restraint. The choirmaster joined me. He spoke of the bells, how their irregularity unsettled rehearsals. He claimed ropes frayed easily in damp weather. His tone was rehearsed, too polished, as though he had practiced this explanation long before offering it. I asked if he had heard the tenor bell strike twice when it should have struck once. He paused only a moment, but long enough. Then he laughed softly, dismissing the thought. "Children miscount," he said. "They always miscount." Outside, the rain had returned, turning the flagstones into a shifting mirror. Lewis asked what I had learned. I told him only that harmony can deceive more than discord. He frowned, waiting for elaboration, but I offered none. That night, the crossword lay open beside my whiskey. 18 down 10 letters. Agreement that hides dissonance. I hesitated before writing it in. Concordance. A word too neat, too tidy for what I had witnessed. I remembered the boy's remark, the librarian's raised hand, the choirmaster's glance toward her. 3 notes in a chord that should not belong together, yet did. False harmony again, the kind Oxford produces daily in its cloisters and common rooms. Appearances bound by tradition, yet beneath them, dissonance waiting to be heard. I also recalled the young lecturer's sleeve, the smear of crimson paint. He had avoided my gaze in the common room, yet his name lay still in the librarian's ledger, half buried by her hesitation. I could not tell yet whether he was the discord or merely another voice carried along by it. As I sat there, the city bells began their uneven chorus, drifting through the night air. Their timing faltered, colliding with one another, and I realized I could no longer tell whether the error lay in the ropes or in my own expectation of order. Perhaps that was the nature of Oxford itself, a place where disorder masquerades as tradition and where false harmonies sustain themselves precisely because they are rarely challenged. The glass of whiskey stood half full on the desk. I thought of pouring another but did not. Instead, I read the woman's letter once more, her words smudged, hesitant. The bells confused me. Yes, they still confused me. But confusion is not absence of meaning. It is the first sign of it. And so I listened to the fading chime across the city, imperfect and unrepentant, and wondered whose hand had guided the rope and whose silence allowed the false harmony to persist. The document came to me not through official channels, but folded discreetly inside a thin envelope left on my desk. No handwriting on the front, no sign of origin. Inside a will, or at least a copy of one. The paper smelled faintly of mildew, as if kept too long in damp storage, then hurriedly withdrawn. The signature at the bottom was genuine enough, though the ink seemed older than the date suggested. Lewis asked whether such things happened often. He said it in that half-jesting way of his, trying to shrug off the discomfort of papers that whisper more than men do. I told him wills appear misplaced only when someone wishes them to. He looked at me with the puzzled patience I had long grown used to. The will left most of its estate to the college library, books, furniture, even a modest sum of money. But it was the final clause that unsettled me. A reference to a bicycle described as belonging to no one, yet required to be preserved in perpetuity. A bicycle preserved. A strange stipulation, written almost as an afterthought. I thought of the abandoned rally, its bell rusting faintly in the drizzle, and felt the letter's shadow fall across it. We took the paper to the college bursar, a small man with quick eyes and an eagerness to prove authority. He insisted he had never seen such a document. His fingers tapped nervously at his blotter, as though each tap erased part of his memory. When I asked where the original was held, he replied too quickly that no copy existed in their records. I thanked him, though he frowned as though thanks implied suspicion. Lewis muttered, once outside, that perhaps it was a forgery. Perhaps, I said, but forged things often contain truths that the original conceals. A misplaced will may tell us less about inheritance than about intent. That evening I returned to the library. The smell of paper and dust pressed down more heavily than usual. The librarian was absent, but her desk bore the faint impression of papers recently removed. The green-shaded lamp left a circle of light on bare wood, like an empty stage awaiting its performer. I sat there for a time, staring at the void, the false harmony of order concealing dissonance. When she returned, she was startled at finding me waiting. She asked if I had come for the sermons again. I said no. I asked whether she had ever known she would leave its estate to a library. She smiled thinly, replying that books required patrons as much as people did. Yet her eyes drifted involuntarily toward a locked cabinet behind her desk. I noticed the key in her hand, pressed too tightly into her palm. She quickly set it down, though the mark it left reddened her skin. Lewis later asked if I had found anything of use. I told him only that hands betray themselves more than mouths do. He sighed, muttering that riddles never fed an investigation. Perhaps not. But riddles nourish truth in quieter ways. Back at my flat, the crossword lay waiting. 21 down 7 letters, something hidden in plain sight, carried from one generation to the next. I wrote it slowly, the word more unsettling than satisfying. Legacy. I folded the will again, slipping it beside the woman's letter and the damp pamphlet. 3 fragments of lives, each speaking indirectly, each withholding more than they revealed. A boy's remark about bells, a librarian's hand marked by a key, a will that named a bicycle no one claimed. The bells rang again that night across Oxford, their sound dulled by mist. They carried no comfort. Only the echo of questions still unanswered, as though the city itself preserved not truth, but its careful misplacement. And in that sound I heard, faintly, the shape of a secret that had not yet chosen to reveal itself. I have always distrusted hymns. Too polished, too certain in their cadences, promising salvation where life seldom grants it. Yet it was in a hymn that the next turn of the case announced itself, not in words spoken clearly, but in something scarcely breathed. The chapel was nearly empty that evening, only a handful of boys gathered with the choirmaster at the organ. The lamps burned low, casting more shadow than light, and the stone floor was wet from footsteps dragged in out of the drizzle. Lewis sat at the back, restless, his patience already stretched. He whispered that nothing would come of listening to children's songs. But I remained. The hymn began, soft and tentative, a melody rising like mist against the dark beams. Their voices wavered, searching for harmony. And there it was, not the note itself, but the absence around it. One boy mouthed words, but let no sound escape. His lips moved in time with the others, yet he gave nothing of himself to the music. I had seen the same in courtrooms, witnesses who repeat rehearsed lines without allowing truth to pass their throats. When the hymn ended, the choirmaster scolded them gently. He asked for strength, conviction, the sound of faith. The boy lowered his eyes, his hands clutching the edge of the pew, as though silence were his only defense. Afterwards, I lingered in the cloisters until the children filed past. Their shoes squeaked against the damp stone, their chatter rising briefly before dissolving into the night air. The silent boy passed last. I asked quietly why he had not sung. He flinched, then whispered, almost inaudibly, that the words were wrong. He said they had been changed. A verse missing, a line displaced. I asked who had changed them. He glanced toward the librarian's shadowed figure near the transept, then shook his head. Lewis frowned when I told him. He said, "Children invent fancies." I answered that invention often conceals its own truth. We parted a little more. He went to find supper. I remained. Inside the chapel again, the hymnals lay scattered along the pews. I picked one up, tracing the ink where pages had been mended. One page was looser than the rest, its edge frayed where glue had not held. I turned it carefully and saw how a verse had been replaced with a false leaf inserted with almost convincing precision. The lettering was smaller, the spacing irregular, a forgery of devotion. I sat for a time, the book resting heavily in my lap. Why alter a hymn? Why adjust the words no one listens to closely, unless the change itself served as a message? Later, at my desk, I opened the crossword. 23 across 8 letters. A voice that does not sound. The answer came easily, though I hesitated to write it. Silence. The words seemed to echo across the pages of the hymn book, across the boy's trembling whisper, across the city bells still clanging their imperfect rhythm. I poured whiskey, its warmth unconvincing against the chill of the evening. I thought of the librarian again, her hand reddened by keys, too tightly pressed into her palm, of the lecturer's sleeve smeared with crimson, of the will naming a bicycle as legacy. All fragments, all partial notes in a hymn that refused harmony. Outside my window the bells rang late, disordered, their tones overlapping until nothing distinct remained. A whispered hymn, a misplaced will, a choirboy's remark, a librarian's silence, each note alone insufficient, yet together forming something I could almost hear. Almost. And still the boy's words returned to me, barely audible, yet refusing to leave. The words were wrong. In Oxford they often are, but sometimes, only in wrongness, the faint outline of truth begins to emerge. The night we returned to the library, rain was falling in thin, persistent threads, the kind that soaks not from above but from all directions at once. The lamps cast pools of yellow upon the pavement, and the stone steps gleamed darkly. Lewis muttered that the hour was unkind for interviews, but I reminded him the librarian had chosen it herself. Invitations offered in secrecy carry their own significance. Inside, the smell of dust and paper pressed heavily against us. The place was deserted save for her, standing by the great oak desk with a lamp glowing at her side. Her hands rested flat upon the wood, as though anchoring herself. She spoke softly, almost as if afraid to disturb the books. She said she had nothing to hide. It is always the phrase chosen by those who do. I asked about the will. Her eyes flickered, then steadied. She insisted she had never seen it. Lewis, impatient, asked about the hymnals, the altered leaf. She did not answer, but her fingers tightened against the desk until her knuckles whitened. Silence, more telling than any words. She gestured at last to the locked cabinet behind her. With deliberate slowness, she drew out the key I had already noticed days earlier. The lock gave a tired click. Inside, stacked in careful disarray, were papers, pamphlets, and books not belonging to any catalogue. Among them lay the missing hymnals, the altered verses neatly pressed, and at the bottom a folder marked with the initials of the young lecturer, whose sleeve I had once seen smeared with crimson. Lewis leaned forward, triumph already forming in his expression. But I saw something else. Her hands lingered on the folder too long, as though reluctant not from guilt, but from memory. She closed it again before Lewis could touch it. I asked her why she had crossed out the woman's name in the ledger. She flinched, and for a moment her composure faltered. She said the name was written in error, a slip of the pen. Yet no librarian slips in such a way. I told her the truth was never erased, only overwritten. Her silence was an answer. The bells began to sound outside, muffled by the rain. She closed her eyes, listening. When she spoke again, her words were scarcely audible. She said the bells had been her signal, a private rhythm known only to one other. A message sent, not for the college, but for someone waiting in the dark. Lewis moved toward her, asking who that someone was. She shook her head, refusing. Her refusal carried the weight of devotion, not fear. In her gaze I saw not calculation, but loyalty, misguided perhaps, but unshaken. I let the silence stretch. She stood there, her figure haloed by the lamp, the books around her like silent witnesses. At last she whispered that she had kept the secrets because books keep them too. Pages hold what voices cannot. Her voice trembled then, but she did not retract the words. Later, in my room, I thought of her hands pressing the desk, of the cabinet's reluctant click, of the pamphlet with its sermon about silence. The crossword lay open. 25 across 9 letters, a keeper of what is not said. The answer came easily. Custodian. I wrote it slowly, the letters leaning into each other like figures in the rain. I poured whiskey, though it gave no comfort. I could not forget the way she listened to the bells, her face tilted upward, as though waiting for music no one else could hear. In that expression lay something perilous, not deceit, but faith. Faith in the wrong person, perhaps. Faith that words altered in hymnals, wills misplaced, bicycles abandoned, might yet preserve what she held dear. The bells faded into silence across the city. I sat alone, the crossword closed, the lamp dim. I felt the truth was close, but not yet within reach. The librarian was unmasked, yet her mask had been less disguise than devotion. And devotion, I have learned, is a veil far more difficult to pierce. Evensong drew me back, though not for comfort. The light was fading as I entered the chapel, the air cool, carrying that faint mixture of incense and damp stone. I had told Lewis he need not come, and he had taken the offer with relief. His appetite for hymns had long been exhausted, though mine had only sharpened. The choir gathered again in their white surplices, voices settling into place like chess pieces before a match. The organ wheezed softly as it drew breath. When they began, the sound rose with all the grandeur one might expect, yet I felt no grandeur. I felt the weight of words chosen, altered, concealed. It is in music, as in crosswords, that omission often speaks louder than addition. The hymn reached its second verse, and I listened carefully. The false page remained, though someone had attempted to disguise the irregularity more deftly. The spacing was tighter now, the ink nearer in tone, but the line, absent before, was still absent. Not an accident. Not carelessness. A silence inserted deliberately, a blank in the score where meaning might otherwise have appeared. I let my gaze wander among the boys. The same child who had whispered to me before mouthed the words without sound, his lips forming syllables that had no echo. He knew, as I did, what was missing. The choirmaster's hand cut the air with precision, urging strength. He glanced again toward the south transept, and though the librarian was absent this time, I saw the habit linger in him, the reflex of a man accustomed to signaling someone beyond the music. When the hymn ended, the congregation shuffled their feet against the flagstones. I sat still, listening to the hush that followed. In that hush, I heard the faint scrape of a chair, moved slightly, almost cautiously, in the gallery above. I lifted my eyes, but the shadows concealed more than they revealed. Afterwards, outside in the cloisters, I met Lewis. He asked if the hymn had offered revelation. I said only that patterns repeat, and in repetition they betray themselves. He muttered something about riddles, then asked if we should seek supper. I told him I preferred whiskey. Back in my rooms, I spread the hymnals, the letter, the will, and the pamphlet across the desk, a silent council of contradictions. Each bore its own absence, its own silence. Together they whispered of a harmony yet unheard. The crossword waited beside them. 27 down 6 letters, a repeated sound, imperfect yet instructive. I wrote it without hesitation. Echo, the same word I had written weeks before, the same that haunted the bells when they faltered in the evening. I poured whiskey and listened to the bells again, their rhythm uneven, their sound caught in the rain. Evensong should have stilled the city, but instead it unsettled it. The music lingered not as consolation, but as a question. I thought of the boy's lips forming words unspoken, of the choirmaster's glance toward absence, of the librarian's hand pressed hard upon her desk. Each detail alone is trivial, yet together pressing upon me with the weight of inevitability. Evensong again, and again the silence within it, louder than the song itself. That is Oxford's gift, to conceal truths in rituals so polished no one thinks to question them. Yet a missing verse, like a missing bell, refuses to be ignored forever. I closed the hymn book, though the sound of its absence remained. The glass beside me stood half empty, the crossword completed, and still the city's bells tolled their irregular rhythm, echo upon echo, calling no one yet heard by all. The city lay in that peculiar half-darkness Oxford favours, where lamps cast long shadows upon wet stone, and the mist softens the edges of everything familiar. I walked alone, Lewis having retired early, muttering something about the futility of listening to the choir yet again. I, however, sought what could only be found in silence, the unmeasured spaces between events, where intention lingers just out of reach. The chapel doors were closed, but the faintest echo of music drifted through the cloisters. Not a hymn this time, but a single note, trembling, sustained, then fading into nothing. It was not the organ, nor the boys. It was the silence surrounding them, a gap pregnant with suggestion. I paused, listening, feeling the rhythm of absence settle against my ribs. Inside, the familiar scent of waxed wood and aged stone enveloped me. I moved slowly, tracing the aisles where shadows pooled beneath the arches. The hymnals lay in neat rows on the pews, yet one was subtly out of place. I bent to examine it. The page, once altered, had been restored, or at least so it seemed, but a faint indentation along the margin hinted at another verse, removed, perhaps pressed into memory rather than paper. Lewis would have called it nothing. Children miscount, books get mislaid, he would have said. Yet I knew the weight of a detail overlooked. The missing line was deliberate, a silence inserted between notes, a whisper where speech should have been. I rose and walked toward the south transept. The librarian had vanished hours ago, yet the impression of her presence lingered, a chair slightly askew, dust disturbed where she had rested her hands. On the desk, a pamphlet remained, dampened at one corner, its sermon about silence lying open. I touched the page lightly, feeling the ridges of pressed ink, the weight of words that had spoken more in their restraint than they could ever convey aloud. The boy from earlier appeared, slipping quietly into the shadows. He did not speak, merely glanced at the hymnals, then at me. His lips moved once, forming words without sound. I watched the cadence of the silent syllables, noting the timing, the hesitation. He was the echo of the absent verse, a vessel carrying what could not be said. I returned to my desk later, crosswords and whiskey laid before me. 31 down 8 letters, a space filled by nothing yet full of meaning. I hesitated, then wrote it carefully. The words seemed to resonate beyond ink, beyond paper, into the damp stone of the cloisters, into the memory of the choir boy's mute voice, the will misplaced, the librarian's secret. Outside the bells tolled unevenly, their sound fractured by distance and rain. Once Twice, a third time, the intervals are more significant than the strikes themselves. The music of absence, unacknowledged yet present, threading through the city with quiet insistence. I thought of the young lecturer's sleeve, the crimson smudge barely noticeable in ordinary light. I thought of the misplaced will and the woman's letter, each a fragment of human intention hidden behind ordinary surfaces, and I saw, with a faint shiver, how they all converged in the silence between notes, in the pauses no one notices, where truth is easiest to obscure yet impossible to remove entirely. I poured whiskey, listening to the lingering echo of a bell, a note sustained beyond its source, a solitary sound fading into the air. It reminded me, as these details often do, that life is measured not in what is stated or done, but in what is withheld, in the careful rhythm of absence that waits for the attentive ear. I closed the hymnals, stacked the pamphlet, and left the chapel. The night air struck my face, wet with rain and carrying the faint scent of wax and stone. Silence stretched across Oxford, and in it I heard the city breathing, the choir paused, and the secret waiting patient in the spaces between notes.